6 levels define what a Primarch can become, and not all of them end in glory. The Emperor built 20 sons, engineering each one as something far beyond a soldier, stronger than any space marine, smarter than any general, capable of leading millions, reshaping entire star systems, and holding together an empire reaching across the stars. He called them Primarchs, and he expected them to be the foundation of everything humanity would ever build. But half of them turned on him. Some became conquerors who never learned to govern. Some built institutions so perfectly designed that those same institutions were used to destroy them. Some surrendered to gods they had spent their entire lives hating. A few became something so far beyond human understanding that entire civilizations reorganized themselves around their presence. This is not a ranking of who won the most battles. It measures what each level actually required, what it cost, and what it broke when it failed. Starting at the bottom, where all 20 of them started with nothing but the planet they landed on and whatever was already inside them. Level 1. The Lost Child. Level 1 is where every Primarch began, landing on a strange planet alone, with no memory of being created, no guidance, and no understanding of what he was built for. Each one arrived somewhere in the galaxy without tools, without any say in the circumstances shaping him. This is where every story in this ranking begins, and in many cases, where every later failure was first planted. The official Imperial story claims the Chaos Powers, the Dark Gods living in the Warp, scattered the Primarchs to break the Emperor's plans. The Warp is the dimension of psychic energy running alongside normal space, fed by the emotions of living beings, and filled with creatures feeding on human fear, rage, and grief. However, in the novel The Unremembered Empire, Guilliman rejected this explanation outright. His reasoning was specific. A mind capable of planning across millions of years would not simply lose 20 engineered sons to an enemy raid. Guilliman believed the dispersal was allowed, perhaps arranged, each son placed into a planet chosen to develop him towards a specific purpose. In this reading, the Emperor did not lose his sons, he planted them. What the gods gave them before they even landed is the part the Imperium never publicized. A warp vision sequence in the novel The First Heretic reveals that the Emperor used knowledge granted by the Chaos Gods themselves to build his sons. Coming to the Dark Powers, asking for the means to forge the Primarchs, receiving that knowledge, and then refusing to pay what the gods expected in return. Every Primarch was built from stolen power before landing anywhere. The Scattered Child phase was already marked before it began. The dreams confirmed it. Kurz dreaming of his own death, Magnus dreaming the answers to the universe's deepest mysteries, each one placed in conditions already shaping him towards a fate written into his circumstances before he was old enough to understand any of it. What those circumstances looked like varied more than almost anything else in this story. Perturabo landed on Olympia with no memory of anything before the previous day, knowing immediately he was a designed thing, not a natural one. He forged a complete blade within hours of his discovery, on pure instinct, holding burning iron in bare hands, while the court of the local ruler watched in silence, declaring the gods of Olympia enemies of reason before spending a single night indoors. The abilities were fully present. What was missing was belonging, and that absence would define everything that followed. Fulgrim's scattered years looked entirely different. Not found by rulers or warriors, a pair of struggling factory workers took him in on the dying planet of Chemos, putting him to work as a laborer in an industrial complex called Calyx. His first recorded act of engineering was designing a sound dampening field as a boy, specifically to protect ore workers from engine damage to their hearing. Growing up in a place of slow collapse and hunger, his response was always to fix things. That instinct survived everything that followed, including his eventual ruin. Angron's beginning was the worst among the 20. Found alone on a mountain summit with no name, he was sold into slavery on the spot, his name assigned by floating camera drones for the amusement of a betting crowd. His first experience of civilization was being thrown into an acid pit with 100 other slaves and told to survive. Feeling every death around him as physical pain, his instinct in that first moment was to protect, not to kill. The system broke that instinct over years of cruelty, then drove neural implants into his skull to make sure the damage held. Known as the Butcher's Nails, Those implants were not his own creation, built to make gladiators keep fighting through wounds that should be fatal. They were installed on Nuceria long before the Emperor's forces ever found him. Mortarion landed on Barbarous, a planet so soaked in poison that only the warlords living above the toxic clouds could breathe freely. The warlord Nakare found the child, gave him a name meaning born out of death, and kept him somewhere between an heir and a test subject, measuring how much concentrated toxin a Primarch's body could absorb. Described plainly across the sources as a prison rather than a home, the walls Mortarion lived within shaped every decision he would ever make, spending his entire youth building towards the moment he could destroy the man who raised him. He discovered that destroying Nakare required asking the Emperor for help, and that asking created a debt he could never pay off. Lorgar's scattered years on Colchis were shaped by a foster father named Corferon, a man doubting the Emperor decades before Lorgar ever did. Raised inside a faith built entirely around his own prophecy, when the Emperor finally arrived, the word-bearer knelt in worship. The Emperor said nothing to correct him. That silence lasted a century, and when it finally ended, it broke Lorgar completely. Some scattered children were found so late that their forces had already built entire identities without them. Jagatai Khan, the 15th Primarch located, arrived finding his white scars had been fighting for 80 years without him. Malkador, the Emperor's closest advisor, later admitted that a full preparation program had been planned for each Primarch. A careful transition from Lost Child to Imperial Commander never delivered because of the scattering. The Warhawk received none of it, his introduction to the machinery of humanity's empire being sudden, unprepared, and hostile to his instincts in almost every way. Handling the memory of their Primarch's origins differently from any other force, the Space Wolves built their entire recruitment process around reenacting what Leman Russ went through on Fenris. Every new recruit drinks the Canis Helix, the genetic formula derived from Russ's own biology, regressing into a feral animal state, losing language and memory, existing as something between man and wolf. Every warrior living through it has, in a specific biological sense, been through what the Great Wolf experienced. The scattered child's trauma became the founding right of the entire force, reproduced in every generation. Alfarius presents the most extreme case. From the moment the Emperor found him, sensing something incomplete about himself that he could not name or explain, he perceived immediately that the Emperor's reassurance was a lie. What was missing, as later revealed, was his twin Omegon, separated during the warp transit of the scattering. The dispersal may not have simply moved Alfarius, it may have split a single being into two, killing every witness to his recovery on the spot. The Emperor ensured the Lord of the Alpha Legion's childhood was conducted entirely in secrecy, a second layer of concealment on top of the original displacement. By age 12, Rabute Guilliman was already as tall as his foster father and physically stronger. Within another year or two, furniture would need to be built for him at a different scale, weapons forged specifically to his size. Every scattered child created this distance from the people around him just by existing, and every one of them had to find a way to live inside a place not built for what he was. Level 1 sits at the bottom of this ranking because it is the stage where a Primarch had the least control over what happened to him. His circumstances were chosen without his knowledge. His early experiences were forced on him, not selected. What he carried forward from those years never left him, and at the next level, that formation became a force. A few of them used it to build something lasting. Most of them used it to conquer, and conquest without a plan for what comes after has a way of producing exactly the kind of destruction nobody wanted. Level 2. The Conquering Warlord. Level 2 is where a Primarch took everything his childhood gave him and turned it into power, building armies, crushing enemies, and forcing entire star systems to submit, but rarely stopping to ask what came after. To ordinary soldiers, this was the complete picture of what a Primarch was for: overwhelming force applied until nothing resisted. The deeper work of building governments, shaping cultures, and holding civilizations together was completely invisible from that level. For several of the Emperor's sons, it stayed invisible for the rest of their lives. Rabute Guilliman's warlord years were already behind him by the time most sources picked up his story. Moving past conquest before Horus was named War Master, the distinction was stated plainly in the novel No Fear. The Lupercal was still a killer of star systems at the moment of his appointment, where the Lord of Macragge had already built something lasting on the other side of victory. The ordinary soldier cannot see that difference. The Primarchs could. Lionel Johnson presents the warlord phase at its most honest. In a dream dialogue recorded across his sources, the Lord of the First assessed his own record plainly, leaving as many places in ruin behind him as any two of his brothers combined. Where others inspired or built or preached, he left darkness and ash. The Emperor confirmed it was sometimes necessary that some of what came before a planet's compliance was too deeply set to simply absorb. Sometimes the only path required is that nothing remains. Because of that, the Lions of Warlord years were not a step towards statesmanship. They were a designed end state, a weapon function rather than a governing one, validated by the Emperor himself. Pertirabo's conquest of the city of Cardis on Olympia shows the warlord phase working close to its most effective. 6 walls that had never been broken in 1,000 years fell in under 3 days. The Lord of Iron deploying armored vehicles in calculated numbers, accepting losses as part of the equation, destroying the defensive tower with concentrated fire before breaching the main gate at point-blank range. Offering the Cardian rulers political entry into his growing power when he won, he calculated that mercy produced better results than destruction at that stage. That calculation held, while the math favored it. However, it would not survive what the Emperor later did to his forces. Fulgrim spent 50 years on Chemos, fighting against the planet's slow collapse before the Emperor arrived, seizing the Calyx complex within months of his earliest memories, dismantling the ruling clan structure governing that dying place. He then eliminated the Sulfa tribe, a nomadic warrior people from whom he had actually learned his swordsmanship because they could not be reshaped to fit what he was building. The Phoenician later admitted wondering what kind of man he would have become if people like the Sulfa had found him instead of the factory workers who did. That awareness changed nothing. The Sulfa are gone. As detailed in the novel Angron, Slave of New Syria, the Slave of New Syria won the uprising on that arena planet within a single New Syrian day, 31 standard hours, with no weapons beyond what starving people could carry. Standing finally before the ruling class he had spent his life fighting toward, he found only frightened, weak men. The conquest was complete and immediately hollow. Because of that, the standard he later forced on his warriors, conquer in 1 New Syrian day, or face punishment, came directly from that victory. The time he won with sticks and rocks became the measure by which his Space Marines were judged, bled, and sometimes killed by their own Primarch when they fell short. Mortarian's warlord campaign on Barbarous ended with a deal. A stranger appearing at a lodge meeting while he was fighting the overlords offered terms, helped defeat Nakare, and the Reaper and his men would swear service to humanity's empire. Accepting because his people needed protection and he needed help, the Death Lord would later describe himself as a champion of common people who abandoned them for a vast and uncaring institution. That framing is important. It is the story he told himself when everything else collapsed. Jagatai Khan's warlord years show a model built on bringing people in rather than cutting them down. Never ruling defeated peoples as a lord standing above them, the Warhawk absorbed them into his own force. Any warrior who could ride, follow an order, and hold ground was welcome, regardless of where they came from. Receiving his Gloriana-class warship, the largest class of vessel built for the Imperium's wars, he threatened the Mechanicum, the great order of engineers and tech priests responsible for building and maintaining Imperial war machines, with destruction if they refused to rebuild it to his exact demands. Eventually named Swordstorm on a suggestion from the Martian engineer, who finally agreed to the modifications, the ship became a symbol of exactly how the Khan operated, demanding the tools he needed on his terms from institutions not built to accommodate him. Level 2 sits second from the bottom because its results, however impressive, do not hold without what follows. Forces built around a single personality collapse when that personality is gone. Star systems taken by force need something more than force to stay taken. The Primarchs who remained at this level longest were not the greatest fighters. They were the ones who caused the most lasting damage, because violence at scale without the structure to contain it does not produce victory. Knowing how to destroy something and knowing what to build in its place are two completely different skills. At the next level, the ones who understood that difference began building something that would outlast them. What they built, and what they accidentally built into it, is where the story gets complicated. Level 3, the Legion Commander. Level 3 is where a Primarch stopped being a powerful individual and became something closer to an institution, shaping a Space Marine force so thoroughly in his own image that it ran as an extension of his will even when he was not present. Every decision here produces effects measured in centuries. Every failure does the same. Roboute Guilliman's approach to leading his Ultramarines is the clearest example of this level, working at its highest. As recorded in the novel Roboute Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, his core thinking was simple: written rules that cannot change become a weakness the enemy will eventually exploit. Living guidance responding to new conditions is what keeps a force effective across generations. Using a single personnel decision, promoting an officer named Iasus over the existing preference, to force a cultural shift in a chapter drifting towards destruction as an identity, the Lord of Macragge knew it would cause disruption and accepted that cost because the long-term gain was a force thinking the same way he did, down to decisions he would never personally oversee. His most direct statement about what this level meant came in a private moment, looking at his stacked written works and telling his second-in-command Gage that he lived in those words, that they were more than his legacy, that they were him. Not writing rules, he was encoding himself into the force's structure so that his judgment would keep running even after his body was gone. That body of work would eventually become the Codex Astartes, the foundational text governing Space Marine warfare for 10,000 years. The Emperor confirmed his trust in this by choosing the Ultramarines to destroy Monarchia. Lorgar's great city, built in the Emperor's honor, was ordered demolished because the Emperor refused to be worshipped. The Avenging Sun privately knew the people of Lorgar City were innocent. They believed what their Primarch had taught them. However, destroying it anyway and carrying the weight of it, his only recorded statement on the matter was that his force took that blow because they were the ones who could stand it without breaking. That is what trust at this level actually costs. Perturbo's command of his Iron Warriors is the opposite demonstration. His best officer, Warsmith Dantiok, assessed him plainly. The Lord of Iron was too proud to challenge bad orders and too stubborn to accept honest reports, contradicting what he wanted to believe. When the Warsmith gave him an accurate account of an impossible campaign, the Hammer of Olympia sent him away permanently. The one officer speaking the truth was removed from the structure, which led to a force becoming unable to function honestly even with its Primarch present. As detailed in the novel The Buried Dagger, Mortarion built his 14th Legion around the Cups ritual. After battle, the Reaper personally selected a warrior, and the two of them shared a drink of mixed toxins, proving the strength of what they shared by surviving it together. Callus Typhon, his first captain, used that exact ritual to deliver the plague that broke the Death Guard, the tradition of shared poison becoming the channel for shared infection. Typhon later transformed into the demon known as Typhus. Herald of the Plague god Nurgle kept his resentment running even 10,000 years after the fall, still believing it was his plans that had brought Mortarion's sons into that god's service rather than the Reaper's own. The fracture in the command structure survived the transformation into something far worse than Space Marines. Corax of the Raven Guard built a force shaped entirely around his own way of operating, and the results showed both what that produced and what it left unfinished, purging the original warriors of the 19th Legion, whose culture contradicted his values. Building instead around spread out authority and individual judgment, his liberation of his home was never finished. His oldest companion, Aaron, told him directly that the job had been left half done. The guilds had gone back to abusing their position, which meant his military victory had not reached deep enough to change what was underneath it, redirecting warriors marked by the Gene Seed Flaw, called the Sable Brand, identified by white skin and black eyes, into the Moritat, a unit assigned to the most dangerous and expendable operations. The Force also maintained technology available to no other group, Whisper Cutters built exclusively on his home planet, and a form of shielding inverting void field technology to make entire units undetectable to every known form of scanning. The Lionel Johnson's command structure was the most deliberately hidden of all. Every Dark Angel officer received only the information his specific role required, no single person understanding the complete picture except the Lion himself and one trusted second. The Hexagrammaton, the 6 specialized wings of the Force, was itself the only visible layer. Below it sat the Order of Santalis, a group with no name and no external existence, designed to embed itself into the formal structure and contain threats the official organization could not acknowledge. Members did not exist as far as anyone outside knew. On top of this, The Dark Angels received their equipment directly from Terra, rather than from any Forge world, keeping technical independence from the Mechanicum that no other force matched. Every layer of the system answered to a single center, the complexity not built up over time by accident, but designed around one man's certainty that humans could not be trusted with the full picture of their own defense. Leman Russ's 6th Legion carried a specific failure running through the force like a crack in a wall. His original companions, men who had known him as a mortal on Fenris, underwent the Canis Helix initiation as adults because the Great Wolf refused to deny them the chance. The process was not built for adults. Most died. Those who lived formed the 13th Company, carrying unstable genetic material, triggering the Wolfen Curse, a regression into something more wolf than man, specifically under the pressure of hard fighting. Wolf Priests, the specialists responsible for monitoring gene seed health, could not detect it in advance, leaving no sign when warriors were at rest. When it triggered during a campaign, the only choice available was to hide it. Adding to this, Russ's warriors kept no written records of their victories, holding to an oral tradition while other forces built documented empires the Crusade administration could measure and reward. That attitude towards record-keeping made them politically invisible in exactly the way that hurt them most. Jagatai Khan inherited a White Scars force that had spent 80 years developing its own identity without him, the gap between Terraborn veterans and warriors from his home planet being severe. Rather than closing it through orders, the Warhawk placed those recruits directly into Shigorian warrior brotherhoods, reshaping them through shared experience over years rather than instruction. By the time of a campaign against an Orc Empire spanning 50 star systems, a Terraborn warrior named Jabal was fighting with the natural instincts of someone raised on the steppe. His commander confirmed the transformation was complete, saying they were all White Scars now. The method was patience applied across decades, and it worked completely. Level 3 sits in the middle of this ranking, because it is the first stage where a Primarch's choices produce effects that genuinely outlast him. The institution becomes more than the man. It also carries his weaknesses at the same scale as his strengths. Every Primarch at this level built something that reflected exactly who he was, including the parts he never meant to pass on. At the next level, those institutions started operating at the scale of entire civilizations. Some of them held, some of them became the very thing that made what followed so much worse than it needed to be. Level 4. The Imperial Crusade Primarch. Level 4 is where a Primarch stopped managing a force and became the center of a project reshaping entire civilizations, commanding not just his space marines, but the full machine of compliance across hundreds or thousands of star systems, building governing structures, administrative networks, and cultural systems designed to last beyond his own presence. His thinking was not in campaigns, it was in centuries. Rebude Guilliman's expression of this level is the most completely recorded across the sources. The 500 worlds of Ultramar were not simply conquered territory, built instead into a working political body, with 4 governing planets operating beneath the Lord of Macragge, chapter masters beneath them, and planetary lords beneath those. An archive called Hall of Fusicon was being constructed on the planet of Kolth to house the knowledge gathered across the entire Crusade, a library meant to outlast the military campaign, generating it. Artists, historians, and poets travel with the war fleet not as passengers, but as essential parts of the effort. As recorded in the novel Rebude Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, he described the records of pacifications, the celebrations of victories, and the memory of the fallen as the living tissue of humanity's culture. Standing at the ruins of a dead human civilization, the Master of Ultramar framed the entire Crusade around an ancient writer's warning that things fall apart when their center cannot hold. The Emperor was not building an empire, he was breaking the pattern by which civilizations had always eventually collapsed, and war was simply the step opening the door. Lionel Johnson occupied a specific role in the Crusade that none of his brothers shared. Where Leman Russ was a warning, a threat the Emperor could point to, the Lord of the First was the final answer. The Dark Angels alone held the Dreadwing, an arsenal kept from every other force, man-portable atomic weapons, tools built to kill specific populations through their own biology, and devices producing singularity effects. No Forge planet maintained it, no other institution had access. As recorded across its sources, The Emperor told Lionel Johnson that the men celebrated at the Ullanor Triumph, the gathering where Horus was named War Master of the entire Crusade, were men needing recognition, and that some men did not. The Lord of the First had not attended. The absence was not a failure, it was confirmation of his nature. Kurz, the Night Haunter, operated at this level with a method having genuine internal logic. Star systems submitted without mass loss of life, the suffering of a few producing compliance, preventing much greater loss later. However, his brothers refused to accept it, and that rejection left him increasingly cut off within the Crusade's command structure. He also carried foreknowledge of the Lupercal's eventual betrayal, his visions showing Horus's fall clearly, yet unable to act on the information in any meaningful way, seeing it coming and responding by ordering the destruction of his own planet, Nostromo. His mind turned the knowledge inward rather than outward, which led to a commander who could see the future and do nothing useful with it. Keeping his distance from Crusade politics by choice, the Khan's white scars outpaced the administration by design, making the force nearly impossible to track or direct. After the Ullanor Triumph, the War Master visited Jagatai Khan on his flagship Swordstorm, urging warriors to stay close and hinting he might need to call on him in time. The Warhawk agreed, saying simply he would answer if called. He later described that exchange as a poor foundation, a vague commitment made at the exact moment something more specific was needed. His chief Stormseer, Yasuge, believed Horus had been trying to warn him, not recruit him. Acknowledging that staying neutral too long was his greatest failure, the Lord of the White Scars took his force to the distant Kondak system shortly after, saying they might never come back. In the novel Dark Imperium Plague War, the Avenging Sun demonstrates what this level looks like 10,000 years later. Reading Mortarian's campaign across the 500 worlds, not as a military operation, but as a ritual, Guilliman identified that this kind of war succeeds only when every step proceeds without interruption, that a setback at any point cannot be recovered from the way ordinary war allows. Identifying the warp clock at Parmenio, the physical device powering the ritual's effects across the entire planet, and destroying it, every dark force in the area weakened at once. That is the specific skill of the Crusade Primarch at this level, reading what the enemy is actually doing underneath what it appears to be doing, and striking the foundation rather than the surface. Level 4 sits fourth because it is the highest level a loyal Primarch can reach through his own choices and character. Above this point, the Primarchs who ascended did so through something else entirely, through being broken, through surrender, or through a combination of both that none of them saw coming until it was already done. Some were taken by gods they worshipped, some were taken by gods they spent their lives hating. In at least one case, the Primarch who opposed the warp most loudly became its most powerful servant, not because he broke, but because his strength was turned against him. Level 5. The Demon Primarch. Level 5 is where a Primarch crossed into something the material universe was not built to contain, giving up a portion of his soul to the warp in exchange for power that no Legion commander or Crusade Primarch could match. Every gift takes something from the Primarch's soul, each dark god permanently binding a piece of the recipient to the Immaterium in exchange for what it gives. The Primarch does not simply gain something, he pays in pieces of himself that cannot come back. Fulgrim's transformation had made him something reality struggled to contain by the time of the heresy's final stages, his physical form shifting with his emotions, growing in response to sensation. His laughter alone tore at the souls of warriors standing nearby, not as a weapon he aimed, but as a condition of his existence that could not be switched off. He could be temporarily held by a sorcerer knowing enough of his true name, and the word-bearer Lorgar used a sorcerer named Layak for exactly this purpose. However, the moment the sorcerer released the bindings, the Phoenician attacked Lorgar immediately, not Horus, the nearest target receiving the violence regardless of alliance. The transformation had replaced loyalty with appetite, and any plan requiring steady commitment over time was now beyond him. Angron's path to this level, as recorded in the novel Angron, Slave of Nuceria, shows what happened in the years before his ascension, spending 2 years alone in the void, traveling from planet to planet, searching for something capable of killing him. The Red Angel explained to Karn that he was supposed to have died on Nuceria with his slave family, that the Emperor's forces had pulled him out just before the military of that arena planet destroyed everyone he had ever known. Every year since then, he was not supposed to have. His rise to demonhood was not a goal, it was the end of a road he had been walking since that place, driven by a wound that never closed, and a death he never got to choose. By the time the series Slaves to Darkness shows the Lord of the World Eaters in operation, he has become something the lesser creatures of the Warp simply recognize and defer to, his forces unable to be placed alongside allied space marines during large operations because contact risks slaughter, the need to kill overriding any purpose. Mortarian's fall was not a moment of weakness, it was a trap built around his honor. As detailed in the novel The Buried Dagger, Callus Typhon, the Death Guard's first captain, engineered the conditions forcing his Primarch's surrender over years of careful preparation. Knowing Mortarian's character exactly, a man hating the Warp with absolute conviction, but having made a specific promise to Barbarous that if he could not defeat N'Kari alone, he would accept a stranger's help. Typhon rebuilt those exact conditions aboard the fleet. The Destroyer Plague overwhelmed the 14th Legion, the Reaper's own body showing signs of infection, the disease taking hold in a Primarch's biology, and proving no one was safe. Facing the same choice he had faced against N'Kari, submit or watch his sons die, his promise forbade any other path. Wings bursting from his spine as the change completed, his entire force transformed with him, their bodies becoming something between flesh and rusting metal, pus, and decay, replacing what had been some of the most durable warriors in the galaxy. Nurgle proclaimed at that moment that a brotherhood was waiting for him out in the stars, a crusade that would etch his name into eternity. Now standing 30 feet tall, his original armor, once white, turned the color of stagnant water, his face decayed on the bone, moth-like wings spreading from his back. The Death Lord's approach to war had changed just as completely as his body. Where the fallen Primarch had once fought through endurance and direct force, he had learned patience, the slow corruption of populations, the use of plague as a weapon moving through entire planets before any army arrived. The Plague God had restructured his thinking as thoroughly as his body. A greater demon named Kugath, one of Nurgle's most powerful servants, read the entire campaign across Guilliman's domain as something simpler underneath the religious framing. The Death Lord proving something to himself about his brother, driving a 10,000-year war from a wound going all the way back to Barbarous. The absolute limit of this level is the god standing above it. As shown in the novel Dark Imperium Godblight, Typhus, the transformed version of that same first captain, delivered a clear warning to Mortarion that he served a god, and the god's needs took priority over his personal campaign. Declaring that no one commanded him, the Plague Gods noticed immediately and eventually pulled his demon Primarch physically back through his realm, making his feelings unmistakably clear. The Reaper could not be destroyed by Guilliman in that campaign. However, he could be humiliated by the very being who gave him his power, which is the ceiling of this level. The god can withdraw, punish, or remove the Primarch whenever he chooses. The power is genuine. The price is that it never fully belongs to the one holding it. Level 5 sits 5th because it represents a genuine jump beyond anything the Legion Commander or Crusade Primarch can match. A Demon Primarch moves between star systems without a ship, pulls entire planets into overlap with the Dark Dimension, and cannot be killed by conventional weapons. However, he also carries the wounds of his mortal life, amplified into something that does not end, serving a will he cannot fully override, existing within a structure he did not choose, and cannot leave. One level remains. Reaching it required either surviving 10,000 years of impossible wait and being renewed by something greater than any individual, or surrender so completely to a god that the surrender itself became permanent power. Only a few of the Emperor's sons ever arrived there, and the difference between which ones did and which ones didn't tell you almost everything about what the Primarchs were actually built for. Level 6. The Mythic Demigod. Level 6 is where a Primarch stopped being a commander or a fighter and became something the galaxy had to organize itself around, generating effects reaching far beyond his physical presence, his space marines, and anything a conventional military force could produce or answer. Two paths lead here. One is the loyal path, defined by surviving an impossible wait and being renewed by something greater than the individual. The other is the traitor path, defined by complete surrender to a god, until the surrender itself becomes a form of power that does not end. Both Rebude Guilliman and Mortarion arrive at this level, representing opposite expressions of what it means to be here. Sources also identify two types within this tier. Some Primarchs at this level operated through physical presence, strategic intelligence, and the weight of everything they had built. Others carried something different, a quality mirroring the Emperor's own ability to appear to each observer as what they most needed to see. Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, is the clearest example of this second type. His presence inspired awe and loyalty in ways that went beyond his physical power or his military record. Multiple sources describe his peers finding him extraordinary, even among Primarchs, and at the moment of his proclamation as regent of a second Imperium, his wings spreading in salute, literally forming the shape of the Aquila, the symbol of imperial authority. With his own body, he was not leading an institution. He was the institution made flesh, the distinction between the symbol and the person having become impossible to see. Lionel Johnson occupies a position within this tier, defined not by strength, but by a property of his existence. Every other Primarch perceives the Emperor through a kind of psychic mask, an image shaped to what each son most needs or expects to see. The Lord of the First alone perceives what is actually there. In one recorded engagement, defeating a psychic being called the Autochthonar, an entity feeding on civilizations for millions of years, not on a battlefield, but inside his own mind, on ground the entity chose. The structure of the lion's mind proved to be a fortress that an ancient intelligence spanning entire star systems could not hold. Jagatai Khan at his peak demonstrates a state Shigorian tradition called Elakge, a condition where thought and action become the same thing, the distance between intention and result effectively nothing. After the death of his companion Giahun, in a tunnel system called a Blood Maw, the Warhawk entered this state and killed every enemy in the inner chamber alone. No one reached him, no one survived. Space Marines watching stood in silence, one of the Luna Wolves trying to enter the chamber to fight alongside the Khan, only to be physically stopped by one of his own men who told him only to observe. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, demonstrates something no other source records as directly: what it means when death itself stops working. Conrad Kurz killed the Fire Drake repeatedly across an extended period, searching for a method that would hold. Every method failed. Vulcan returned. A specific ritual weapon, the Spear of Telesto, was ultimately required to produce a result approaching something permanent. Vulcan is proof that within this tier, individual Primarchs differ not just in degree, but in kind. Some of them cannot be permanently ended by any force the material universe can deploy, which means death requires a completely different definition for beings operating at this level. Rebude Guilliman's expression of this level is the most fully recorded across the sources. In the novel Rebude Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, a Space Marine officer named Iasis watches the Lord of Macragge fight in the tunnels beneath the planet of Thoas, spending his life committed to the idea that reason explained everything. Watching the Avenging Sun fight gave the officer, for the first time, a clear understanding of why people have always needed gods. Guilliman did not do anything impossible, simply so perfectly precise that each movement followed from reason exactly as it had to, in exactly the order, and with exactly the force the situation required. Iasis could not classify what he was seeing as human achievement. The line between superhuman and supernatural had stopped meaning anything, which led to a rationalist Space Marine understanding, for the first time, why myths exist. As further detailed in the same novel, a Space Marine named Hyrax carried real anger towards the Avenging Sun for a genuine grievance held over several days. Walking into the bay where the officer was waiting, the Lord of Macragge said nothing. The anger was suspended before a single word was spoken, not resolved, but suspended by proximity alone. The connection between a Primarch and the Space Marines, built from his genetic legacy, is a biological relationship between the original and the copies made from it. Physical closeness to the source, acting on those copies below the level of conscious thought. Describing himself as the point where everything in his force met, the source from which it all flowed, Guilliman understood that removing him would not simply weaken the system. It would remove what held it together. In the novel Dark Imperium Plague War, the The confrontation between the Avenging Sun and the Death Lord is the clearest direct comparison the sources offer. Two beings at this level in direct exchange, neither producing a clean result in that moment, each speaking from the values defining his particular version of what it means to be here. The Master of Ultramar tells his fallen brother that he knows what he is, and knows without doubt that he carries out the purpose he was built for. Mortarion flinches. That physical reaction, the only involuntary response the Death Lord shows in the entire exchange, says everything. The accusation that he became what he spent his life opposing reaches past 10,000 years of transformation, past the power of a god's investment, straight to the wound there since Barbarous. A historian named Suleimania, observing Guilliman closely and finding herself using mythic language despite spending her career rejecting it, uses the word demigod directly and without qualification. When word of the Imperial Regent's approach reaches the besieged planet of Tyros, a population living underground for 100 years begins emerging before his forces have arrived. His name breaks a century of wait before he sets foot on that planet, his effect on civilian morale operating completely independently of anything he physically does. 6 levels and 20 suns, each one shaped by a planet that had no idea what it was raising. The scattered child became the warlord became the commander became something the galaxy either organized itself around or had to survive. Not all of them made it through cleanly, most of them didn't. The ones who fell the furthest started in exactly the same place as the ones who held, and that is the most important thing this ranking reveals. Understanding what the Primarchs became makes the next question obvious. What happened to the sons they left behind? Whether the Space Marines who inherited the Codex or the Chaos Space Marines who rejected everything it stood for, those are the two stories that follow directly from everything examined here.